just to introduce us, I'm Abi. I'm a researcher at the Centre for Education and Youth, and Ellie is the head of research. And so, as you can see on the slide, we're here to talk about the chapter looking at Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people's experiences. The chapter opens with Ellie talking about the roundtable that she hosted during the KCL research project on Gypsy, Roma and Traveller access to higher education, which funnily enough is where we met for the first time and the first time I'd ever come across CfEY. So this is quite a nice full circle type thing. Ellie, would you like to get started on slides?
Great. So we're going to present some of the findings and some of the stories from our book chapter for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have about 5-10 minutes for questions and discussion, and I think it's a good size group for that. So if for now, if you have got any background noise, you can just mute yourself, and I'm praying I won't have background noise, then that would be great. And then when we come to the discussion, then we can all have our microphones on. So we're excited to talk to you today about a group of young people who are so often forgotten. I'm not able to start by showing you a single picture of them or giving you a quick definition of who they are, because GRT, Gypsy, Roma, Traveller, is an umbrella term for many groups, and each family and community varies just like any other family or community does. What I can tell you is that as a group, GRT young people are among the most marginalised in our society and our education system. The disadvantage that they face plays out in almost every outcome that you can measure. GRT young people are less likely to attain well at every stage of education. They're less likely to even stay in school and complete their qualifications. They're much more likely to be excluded, and they're much less likely to go to university than any other ethnic group. And in our chapter, we look at those statistics from early years to higher education, mapping out how these young people start their education journey far, far behind their peers and don't catch up. Of course, when we're talking about a group, any group, it's really important to acknowledge that the group level picture misses the individuals who don't face disadvantage or those that succeed and get excellent outcomes, even though they have faced challenges in their community. When researching this topic, I've really met many people from GRT backgrounds who thrived in education, achieved really well, and they're always really keen to tell me and to remind us all that GRT people are part of our communities, they're within our society, and they're not completely separate, even though they are often on the margins. And one research participant right at the beginning of my research about this community back in 2017 told me, you know, people need to know we're doctors and we're lawyers, we're teachers, we're hairdressers, we're everywhere, but people often don't know it. And the reason that sometimes GRT people feel they can't share their ethnicity or their identity with others is because they fear the discrimination that might follow, which essentially brings us to one of the key themes that runs throughout the chapter that we're going to talk about today. And that is prejudice, discrimination, and racism against this group. So in our research exploring the barriers specifically to HE participation, but also to engagement with education as a whole, faced by GRT young people, we find that prejudice and discrimination link all those challenges together. So GRT children, young people, and their whole families face racism in the education system and beyond the education system. And by that, I mean both explicit racism, racist abuse, bullying, and also systemic racism, which results in those really, really stark outcome disparities. Now, over 15 years ago, Sir Trevor Phillips described racism against Gypsies and Travellers as the last respectable form of racism, and we talk about this in our chapter. Recently, there have been really interesting and frankly really depressing debates about whether this is true, and unfortunately that's not because people feel that this no longer exists. It's that all too often we're seeing racism against other ethnic minorities is seen by some as entirely acceptable or entirely respectable. So what we're not doing here is arguing that racism against Black people, against Asian people, any other ethnic minority is less real or has less impact. It's not a zero-sum game, as I'm sure most of us agree. Addressing discrimination and racism will include addressing all types of racism. And what we are doing, though, is highlighting just how rampant the racism and casual prejudice against GRT communities is in our society, and highlighting through the chapter how that influences how they engage with our education system, and ultimately often a reluctance or a fear of doing so. So this is just one collection of headlines that should be quite familiar to many of us. This was collected by the Traveller's Times a few years ago. typical headlines mentioning gypsies and travellers and generally focusing on how you wouldn't want them near you. You might be familiar with examples of anti-gypsy and traveller racism from sort of historic photographs and stories, but I would strongly argue it's not an issue that is consigned to history. It's something that people are experiencing things like this now. The media, of course, plays a really significant role in propagating stereotypes about gypsy and traveller communities. When I was doing the research for King's College London, a mother who is an English gypsy, talking about her children's experiences of education, told us how her children were mercilessly bullied when this programme came out. Thankfully, in some senses, the series ended in 2015, which is fairly recent, but at least they're not still making it in the UK. However, this time last year, Channel 4 chose to run this so-called documentary about travellers. And although Ofcom received over 7,000 complaints about it, many people seem to feel that it was just reporting facts, or that it was entirely acceptable to take this approach of talking about an entire community. Unfortunately, the past month has given me so many examples to sort of continue to exemplify how this is a real issue that's happening now, that's so mainstream. I'm sure many people saw on the news the news about the Pontoon's blacklist of Irish surnames, which was really made ever more shocking by, frankly, the amount of people who on social media defended it, as if it's fair or acceptable in any way to decide a family and children's right to a holiday on the basis of their surname. Unfortunately, this has continued in the last fortnight. Sir Roger Gale, MP for Thanet, wrote a letter a couple of weeks ago to constituents reporting that the behaviour of some travellers brings disrepute upon the whole community. I feel so frustrated by this. Surely it's clear that to refer to some theoretical individual's behaviour as impacting on a perception of a massive group of people is clearly stereotyping. Anybody that cares about addressing discrimination wouldn't go down that path. Just last week, running on a really depressing month at the moment, the Shadow Equalities Minister had to apologise after endorsing and promoting leaflets that her team was handing out that described travellers, traveller communities visiting the community as an incursion. What does this have to do with schools and colleges, you might ask, and universities and the education sector? First of all, what happens outside the education sector in mainstream media, in politics, is reflected within our schools. But perhaps more importantly than that, or more on a day-to-day basis, it's really important that our schools, colleges, universities explicitly condemn these instances of racism, which are happening weekly, as we can see, to make sure that pupils from these backgrounds feel safe in those places, and also crucially to ensure that pupils from other backgrounds receive a message to counteract what they're told in the mainstream media. Now, of course, in our chapter, we explore broader barriers and look at sort of a more holistic experience of Gypsy, Roma or traveller people going through the education system. And I'd love it if you guys would read the chapter and hear about those cultural and material barriers. But what I wanted to talk about today is that it's important to recognise that prejudice, a lack of inclusion, a lack of flexibility in the mainstream system reinforces all those barriers. It's always kind of under the surface of them. For example, we talk about material barriers. GRT families are more likely to live in poverty or have unsuitable housing. And just like any child that lives in poverty, that has an impact on their education. However, the lack of stopping places for those GRT communities that are mobile, which is at some parts of the year about 1 in 3, so it isn't all of them, but it is driven by discrimination, exclusion, and state-sanctioned discrimination because of the rules that restrict those communities from living the lives that they want to live. And so again, we see how the housing and poverty issue, which is sort of described as material barriers, always link back to that discrimination and the marginalisation that community faces. I'm going to hand over to Abi now to tell you a story of one of the families that are affected by the range of challenges we described who are included in our chapter.
Thanks, Ellie. So in my previous role running an advocacy service for Gypsy, Traveller and Roma families, I had the pleasure of working alongside Rosaline and her family. Rosaline initially got in touch to see if we'd be able to help with school uniform costs, and over the next 2 years we were able to provide support around other issues that the family faced, including school admissions, exclusion and transition to secondary. We've told this family story in the book chapter as it illustrates the different challenges that Gypsy, Traveller and Roma families can face in the education system, and it also provides some examples of the support that was helpful for the Cooper family. The family knew what they needed in order for the children to do well at school, but the barriers built into the systems that they were navigating meant that they needed help. When I first met the family, the 3 school-aged children were attending their local village primary school. It had a great reputation, but the family didn't feel welcome and like they were part of the community. Within the village, attitudes towards the families living on the Traveller site were fairly hostile, and that continued on the playground. In a neighbouring village was another school, where a few other Gypsy and Traveller children attended. The school had a reputation for being inclusive, and a couple of families that the Coopers knew spoke really highly of it. So Rosaline decided to transfer the children to that school. This all went smoothly, and they settled in really well. However, when the time came for one of the youngest to begin reception, Rosaline discovered that he had not automatically been offered a place with his siblings, as she'd expected, and the new intake class was full. Rosaline was a smart, capable woman who struggled with low literacy, a result of dyslexia combined with an education that was cut short due to the racism that she herself had faced in school as a pupil. She hadn't known which forms needed filling in, she wasn't aware of the deadline, and she was really worried about enrolling him in the school that hadn't supported his sisters. To make things harder, the site wasn't hooked up to broadband, so the family didn't have stable internet access or even a computer. We went through the paperwork together, making sure he was on the waiting list for the school the other children attended, and we wrote a supporting letter explaining how important it was that he attended the school that would provide the right support, and not just the one that was geographically closest. While filling out forms and support with paperwork was useful, ultimately Rosaline needed her children to attend a school that understood her and her family, their culture, their strengths, their needs, so they could work together to make sure her children were learning and thriving. In an ideal world, this would have just been the school in their village. Do you want to flick to the next slide, please, Ellie? Thank you. The support that they accessed helped to improve things in 3 main areas: the relationships with staff in school, flexibility to access support and find out what works for them and their children, and inclusion, valuing differences as well as similarities and tackling racism robustly. In our chapter, we explore each of these 3 areas in a lot more detail.
Thanks so much, Abi. I'd like to end our overview of the chapter by explaining one of the other key messages that I talk about throughout. When I sat down to write the chapter 2 years ago, which is how long it takes to get a book on the shelves to you, it was 2 years following the beginning. It was 2 years after the beginning of my journey researching this community. I spent some time getting up to date with the research that's been published since ours and dug back into the history a little further. I was again struck by how the research finds time again the same challenges and issues faced by some in the GRT communities, and yet little has changed. So here are 2 quotes from 2 government reports, 2 different reports, and I'll just give you a second to read them. I'm sure you'll agree that those quotes are really similar, and yet these are the dates that they were published, the first from the Plowden report and the second from a report by the APBG and Gypsy and Travellers a couple of years ago. It's really absolutely clear to me, and I hope you agree, that action really needs to be taken to improve the outcomes for these pupils. The stats that are in the chapter are really stark, and I really hope that our book chapter can broaden people's understanding of these communities while providing that nuance, and also provide some of the recommendations that schools can start to implement to lead the change that these pupils desperately need. So I'd like to invite any questions, and if you would like to do that by either raising, I think there's enough for us to just jump in. So feel free to unmute yourselves, and any comments or questions really welcome. And we've got about 5 minutes left, so it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, I can kick off if no one's
Go
got
for it,
anything.
Ryan.
Yeah, just great chapter again, and really kind of showed my remarkable levels of ignorance. Um, I suppose, kind of, if you're a school leader, one comment might be, well, we haven't got a big traveller community, so why do I need to know this stuff? And we would never say that about any other group. We wouldn't say, well, we don't have a diverse range of ethnic groups in the school, so I don't need to know about racism in that area. How do you think we can make this a mainstream issue? I think you guys made a great point saying it doesn't come from our politicians. It is a form of bullying in schools, which is probably okay in inverted commas. So how do you think we can make this a mainstream issue? Is it kind of top down, or is it kind of bottom up?
So in terms of from top down or bottom up, I'd say at the moment bottom up, because I feel like what we're seeing from the top down is not only not helpful, but actually actively unhelpful. Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of schools do feel like, oh, this isn't about our community. We don't have these groups. A couple of things I would say about that: I'm not sure that you know that you don't. Some GRT communities travel, and so when they're in a community, people know that they are because they live on a traveller site, and they'll often want to go to the same school, so it can be sort of, like I say, obvious. Other people from these communities live in bricks and mortar, as they say. They're not travelling, and they, essentially you wouldn't necessarily know that they're there. And if they are in a school that they feel is not really explicit about welcoming those communities, they may well not tell you or even ascribe on school census forms or anything like that their actual ethnicity. So there's that. And then there's the other thing that, as we saw at the beginning when we're talking about the racism and discrimination, Abi and I chose to pick up on that for this presentation. That's the messages that people are getting in the mainstream, and all of your pupils will go out into the world one day, and there'll either be people that complain to Ofcom about the documentary, or people that are on social media saying, well, travellers do commit a lot of crimes. I've seen one traveller commit a crime back when I was 15, so that must be true. And I think it's our job as educators to get all young people to understand that what they might be told outside school is not okay. Abi, I don't know if you have any further comments on that, or if anybody else wants to jump in.
I think there was just one further point. I think I agree with everything you were saying, Ellie. And it was just something that stuck with me from quite a while ago. I was listening to a traveller activist talking about the kind of changes that she saw as necessary for education to be more inclusive. And she kind of listed all these like different points of practice, and then at the end just closed with like, all of these things will make school better for everyone. So the things that are good practice for including marginalised groups are generally things that, it's good for all young people. So I think where we've talked about flexibility in relationships and inclusion, those three key principles are things that should be like prioritised anyway.
When I started teaching, like very long ago, well, it's not actually very long ago. I know there's people that have been doing it for like 30 years. So like, this time isn't much, but the school that I worked at had a large traveller community nearby. And we were really lucky in that we had someone on our staff body who was almost like, she was called a liaison officer. And she knew the community so well. And she also had brilliant relationships with families, and students like came to school. I mean, there was I'm not saying it was 100% right. There was so many issues still within inclusion and making it work for everyone. But is that something you've seen elsewhere? It's not like this sort of liaison officer model.
Abi, I'm going to let you take that because you've got that experience, but I'm also just going to warn you, we've got just under 2 minutes. Go.
Yes, basically. So quite a while ago, there were traveller education services across the country. They were funded by local authorities, and they provided those kind of liaison roles. However, from about 2008 onwards, those have been cut, and barely any exist across the whole country at all. So my previous role, I worked for a non-profit organisation providing that kind of service, but it was a national project staffed by 2 people. Because that was all there was. So those roles are super, super valuable, but they just don't exist. In our chapter, we've spoken about one school in particular as a case study, who employed a member of the local Gypsy community to do that role in their school and had brilliant results from it. Like, it really smoothed things between the community and the school. And so I think more and more, I think that that's the answer. I don't necessarily think that schools should be the ones to have to run that themselves. It should be kind of a more accepted part of like good practice. But I think employing community members to support their communities and kind of that, then it's not so much for school saying this is a problem and we need to fix it. It's saying like, let's work together.
Yeah. And I think I'm either going to get cut off in 20 seconds or we're going to get another minute and then we're going to be like, oh, we finished. But I was going to say that I think schools having to be a bit more inventive about that at the moment, as Abi says, to employ community members in other roles, and in order to give that message of inclusion, is one way to do it. Now, I've just got a pop-up that says leave the breakout room, which I hope will return us to the session rather than jump us out completely. But thank you so much for joining us here. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you'll read the chapter. I hope you'll get in touch to talk about it. And yeah, really appreciate it and enjoy the rest.
Thank you. It's great.
Bye, guys.